Today I'm going to make a basic dot bead, and first I'm going to heat up my rod of glass, and then I'm going to preheat my mandrel. You want to have a nice warm mandrel so that the glass winds on more smoothly. And also make sure your bead release is dry so you don't get any bubbles from any moisture boiling off as you add the hot glass. I'm just going to wind on some hot glass. There's lots and lots of videos out there that deal with how to make a basic bead, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I just go nice and slow. You don't want to be tugging hard or you could crack the layer of bead release on your bead. And every now and again I'm turning my rod around so that the other side of it heats. That just helps me wind the glass on just a little bit faster. You wind on glass until you have a bead that's about the size that you want it to be, and it doesn't look much like a bead at this point. So we're just going to heat it until the glass starts heating up nicely, and it will start to flow. And just like a droplet of water will be round given half a chance, glass is the same way. As it heats up, the surface tension of the glass will pull that bead to being a nice round bead around your mandrel. The trick is to get the bead centered on the mandrel, and that's a matter of practice and just watching the glass. I tend to watch the top edge of the bead, and as you can see, it kind of goes bump up, bump up. So what I do is once I get the glass nice and hot, I pause where there's a high spot and let it drip, and then turn all the way around a couple of times to find the high spot and pause, turn, 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 pause, and then eventually when I get it somewhat centered, I lift it up out of the flame, and I keep doing that same thing. I turn and watch for a high spot and pause. You might need to tip your mandrel just a little bit to the left or the right to get your glass centered left and right. And then you just keep turning and turning while that glass is setting up to try and get a nice balanced bead. Once you've got a nice balanced bead and it's firmed up, keep turning while you're looking around on your workspace for a different color of glass, while you're talking to someone or anything else. You always keep the mandrel turning, because even though it looks like it's set up, this glass could still be slightly liquid, and if you stop turning it, it'll drip off center. And it's much easier to keep a bead on center than to try and get it back on center, especially once you start decorating it. Now there's kind of a big blob of white on the end here, so I'm going to grab my pliers and just pinch that extra bit off, because trying to make a small dot with a great big mass of glass is a really kind of a pain in the butt. The other thing is I'm keeping the rod of glass pointed downward instead of tilting it upward, and that's going to keep that glass from gathering up at the tip. I'm going to get it nice and hot and come out of the flame. I'm just going to pause for a second, and then I'm going to touch down, pull back, and then go into the flame and melt off. Heat up a gatherer glass, pause for a second out of the flame. You have lots of time if you heat up a little bit more glass than you think you'll need, and then let it cool off. Heat up, come out of the flame. I'm touching down absolutely perpendicular to the mandrel, as perpendicular as I can get it, because if you come in at kind of a weird little angle, it's much harder to figure out exactly where you're touching down. Also, I'm going to reheat my bead because I've been nattering on a bit, and you don't want your bead to get too cool. I've got one more dot here. Touch, pull back, and melt off. So now I've got 4 dots on there that are relatively evenly spaced. They're not perfect, but this is just a test bead, so they don't have to be. I heated those dots until they rounded up a bit, and now I'm looking at them, and some of the dots are stuck up a little bit higher than the other ones, so I'm going to heat just individual dots to let the ones that are sticking up a little bit higher melt down more, so that all the dots have about the same height going around the bead. Now if I want to, I can add more dots, and when you're adding dots, you don't want to just come in from the side like this. You tilt your bead so that you can look down at the space where you want to add a dot, and that's a lot easier than holding it this way and trying to come in from the sides, which just feels really weird, and you can't aim nearly as well. So if you tilt your mandrel you can put those dots in much easier. I tend to reheat about every 4 dots. If you're just beginning, you probably want to reheat your bead a bit, probably every 2 dots, just so that the bead doesn't get too cool, because if it cools off too much, it could crack. So now I'm going to heat those dots in, and I'm going to pause a second and look at them from a couple of different angles and say, yeah, those are all about the same size. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my hand so that I'm holding the mandrel this way, and it's much easier then to point the mandrel down at the table to put dots on this back side of the bead. You'll notice when I'm heating, I'm rotating the rod slightly so that I heat an even amount of glass all the way around the rod. That helps you put a more round dot onto the bead. If you're just heating one edge of the rod, you're going to get a dot that's a little bit more oval shaped. So now there's a nice basic dotty bead. I'm going to let it cool up and kind of look at it and see whether or not all those dots are about where I want them to be. I think this one right here on the edge could be melted in just a little bit further, so I'm just going to heat it a bit. And that looks pretty darn good. So I'm going to call that a finished bead, and I'm going to pop this bead into the kiln where it'll stay nice and hot all the time that I'm working, and then it'll cool down, and when it anneals, I'll show you what the finished bead looks like.